Thank you, Achan. Thank you, Kachima, and welcome everyone who is participating in this Bible study session this evening. I'm happy that people are really interested in going through the biblical study program. Bible, as you all know, is something that has been translated to most of the languages in this world, and also the largely circulated book in the whole world. But to me, as a student of Bible, particularly the Old Testament, sorry to say that the understanding about Bible and the content in it has been so much distorted among various communities, denominations, and people. How do we look at the Bible in a genuine, systematic, and understandable manner? That's our question to start with. Of course, you may raise questions about what I present today, or later you may be able to hand over your questions to Robin, and we will discuss that also in future. But let me start the session today with the question: what should be a genuine approach to Bible? What is it? In general terms, it is a collection of books. But what is in those books? That's another question. To me, as my understanding goes, it is a collection of testimonies of human experience of God's work in this world. Let me repeat it. It is a collection of testimonies of human experience of the work of God in this world. There are various kinds of approaches to this particular book. But the problem is, if we look into what is in this book, you may find many of these approaches do not do justice to the content. And that is why we are again searching for an answer to the basic question: what is it? There are three basic elements that we see in all these books and generally in the Bible. The first element is God Himself. God, who can be known only through His deeds. There could be a question regarding that. But the issue is, God is so distant that human mind cannot conceive the self of God. There are people who would say there are names given to God, or we call Him by a particular name, or whatever it is. Still, a name should express the identity, personality, and the self of the bearer of the name. But in the case of God, we cannot do that, because God is distant from human understanding. But we need to understand also, how do we understand God? We understand God only through what He does in this world and in the life of everyone else. When God does something, there are only two ways of doing. One is creative work. The second is liberative or redemptive work. There again we may have a question. We see in a lot of instances God punishing, God cursing, or something like that. We may have to find an answer to that. God can only, and that is a limitation with God, can only create and liberate. Then the second element in the Bible is the human experience. The experiences are understood by human. It doesn't mean that human can exhaustively understand what God does, because these are in two different strata. God in His wisdom does something, and in our limited wisdom we try to understand it. And there is a gap, there will always be a gap between what God does and what we understand. Something, God creates something, and we may think it is a destructive work of God. God redeems, but we may understand it as something destructive. Our cultural context, our makeup, all will have its own effect on the way we will understand God's work in this world. So there is God, and then we who try to see what God is doing in this world, in our life, or generally in this world. And the third element is when we experience God's work, we understand in one way, and then we may have to express it either in writing or in speaking. Then again we have limitation. Now you may have heard people saying, what shall I say, what shall I say? Because our language is so limited in scope to express even the idea we may have in our head. It will be much more than that when we try to understand God's work and try to express it either in writing or in words. These three elements need to be specifically and very urgently considered before we read the Bible. Then again, when people started seeing God, experiencing God, and try to convey the message, there is a problem. In the earlier days, there has never been a writing skill. The language was more or less oral, and therefore writing skill was not there when earlier people lived and experienced God's work. When writing is not there, or writing is not an easy task, people remember things and then spread it over orally. But again, orally transmitting something will keep on adding on or subtracting. because it's very hard for people to remember exactly what was said earlier and what is to be said presently. Then again, when things are to be written down, what you remember may not be what actually you understood. This is where we have the question of oral tradition and written tradition. In Old Testament times and also in New Testament early days, much of the experience of people with God were kept in oral tradition. The symbols of or signs of oral tradition transmitting and then converting into written tradition can be seen in biblical records. And that will tell us that what is being conveyed to us need not be what actually happened. This raises a big question when we consider the title of many of the translations of Bible, Holy Bible. How holy the biblical testimony is need to be a question in our minds. When the Bible was written down, I don't think anyone wanted it to be holy. Rather, wanted it to be personal or community expressions of their understanding or their experience with God. But later, it became holy, universal, and something that has to be obeyed or followed. One simple example is the way women are treated in our community, the church. Now, Paul, you may have attended wedding ceremonies, was a Jew, but at the same time he was converted into Christianity. So he had this both traditions, and both traditions were so strong in him that sometimes he would go astray. In Galatians, Paul advises the church regarding the relationship between husband and wife. Paul initially says, husband is the head and wife is the body. But then his Christian understanding or Christian tradition comes up and he says, there is neither male nor female in Christ. Mutual participatory life is what is to be taken from Jesus' command, which he gave when somebody asked, can I divorce my wife? Paul was a bit confused between his default tradition and his understanding of the way of Jesus. And that is why he is saying that. So what I mean is the word holy need to be reinterpreted, and therefore in some of the English Bible it is simply the Bible, which means the book is given as title. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have any sacred element in it. It does have sacred element. All these three elements which I mentioned are truly sacred. First is God himself, and second is human, and third is expression of human. These three are sacred, but we need to look into these three closely to see what is sacred in it. And that brings us to the question, how do we approach the Bible? Bible is a resource for us to understand the ways of God through the experience expressed by human beings. If we go anywhere other than that kind of an approach, we will be misled according to my understanding of the Bible. I was today once again searching for a comparative study of genealogy that is given in the book of Matthew and in the book of Luke. In Matthew chapter 6, 9 following, and Luke chapter 11, 1 following. It was handed down through oral tradition, and when they got it differently. So they wrote it differently. And therefore, we may have to assume or understand that it is not to say who is the father of whom or who is the son of whom. Rather, it is a way of giving a continuity of God's work being carried through generations. Apart from that, the names are not that important. Or if there is a missing name, or if there is a addition to that, we don't need to be worried about that. That's one test that we may have to take when we try to understand Bible. Then again, another example, if I may say, is what happened in the Garden of Eden in Old Testament. In the Garden of Eden, the woman went and plucked the fruit from the tree, and if you may follow the events, God appears, and the way it is given is as a human being coming on to the garden. In the evening, the footstep of God was heard. We can very well say that God doesn't need any legs for him to come. So it simply would mean that the presence of God was felt in the midst of something happened in the life of human which was not supposed to be happening. Then everybody thinks, and also it is written, that God sent human out. Well, just before those statements, if you look, human was already out. He went out and hid himself behind a tree. So God didn't have to send them out. God had only to prevent them from coming in. That is stated there. God didn't have to send them out. Rather, they were already outside. There again, the kind of work God is doing in the midst of people can be seen on two grounds. One is he prevented them from coming in so that they will not eat of the tree of life and live eternally in an estranged situation, because they were already outside and hiding themselves from the sight of God. Then again, they tried to cover themselves with fig trees leaf. That is the kind of understanding about the life and protection human had about themselves was not sufficient enough for them to be protected. And that is where God provides them protection to body and to life. This is where what I said earlier would comes to meaning. God did not punish them. They punished themselves. And even in punished environment, God was trying to protect them, redeem them from being totally destroyed. This is how we need to read the Bible. There are several occasions when it is said that God punished them, God punished these people, God killed these people. These are all human interpretation of what happened in the history. It is a fact that anyone who goes away from God and tries to do something stupid will have to face the consequence. That consequence cannot be prevented by God, because that consequence has to be there for human to learn from their deeds. Again, a third thing that I would say is God has not otherwise, except from his deeds, revealed himself to human. A very popular instance that we have, people using it as God expressing his own name, is Moses meeting God in the burning bush. Moses finally, after God commanding him to go to Egypt and address Pharaoh and liberate the people, Moses asked God, "Whom shall I say that sent me?" For a Hebrew language student, it was said in future tense. The Hebrew language students would say imperfect Hiphil form. Hiphil form is causative. But when it was translated into Greek and later to Latin and further to other languages, they all followed the Greek translation. In Greek, you have present tense, whereas in Hebrew language of the old, there was no present tense. So there was no space for God to say, "I am," because that is present tense. Rather, God said, "I shall be," in future tense. Because in Hebrew language, there was no present tense, only past tense and future tense. And if I repeat the phrase that is given there, Ahye, Asher, Ahie. And from Ahie, there are 4 syllables which later are used to make the name Yahweh, the word Yahweh. Yahweh, which is not supposed to be the name of God, rather the kind of work God is undertaking in this world. There are a lot of people who would say the name of God which was revealed to Moses was Yahweh. No. There was no proper name given to Moses. Name given means, in Hebrew thought, coming into subordination. If you name somebody, then you are subordinating that person. This is what happens in the Garden of Eden when God created and brought all animals and creatures before human. Human named them. You can't name God because He is the creator of human. Then again, there is another confusion in that. Well, let me finish the first one, earlier one. God was saying, I shall show you what I shall be. Ahie, Asher, Ahie. Because you cannot understand God in His essence. Rather, you can understand God only through His work. And when we see the work of God in our midst, the way we understand need not be what actually God intended for us to be understood. And again, the third one, when we express in words or in writing what we understood, may not need to have much about what God did. This confusion is always there in the Bible. Then again, a third example is God created whom? God created Adam. That's a masculine word. And everybody think that he was male. And with this understanding, the Pharisees went and asked Jesus, can I divorce my wife? Thinking that male was created and as a subordinate female was created out of the rib of male. Yes, of course, Adam is a masculine word, but its feminine form is not woman. Its feminine form is earth. Adama is earth. The Pharisees got the answer from Jesus. Jesus said, in the beginning, God created male and female, full stop. Which means Adam has to be translated and not as man, rather human. This was totally misunderstood by everyone who reads the Bible. So there are several instances, more than what I already said, which would say that we did not understand Bible well enough and we did not teach Bible the way it should be taught. And this is our issue. Well, I will probably, I told Kochama this morning that I will speak only for half an hour and then open the session for any questions, clarifications, or also any contention. So let me reiterate in few words what I already said. The Bible is the record of the experience of human with God when he did something. And God, on his part, does only two things. First is creation. Second is salvation. But when we see these two, we many a time misunderstand. And many a time when something happens, we misinterpret. And when we misrepresent or misinterpret, the message becomes wrong. Whereas when we read Bible for a better understanding, we don't need to look into the details, but rather to the core, to see what God did in these two terms. God is a creative God who creates continuously, and God is a redeeming God who redeems continuously. But on human's part, on the one hand doesn't understand it well enough, and on the other hand, without understanding it properly, misrepresent and misinterpret, or to say that God punishes humans also, or God did something adverse, or God did something that will destroy. God cannot destroy. If God created something will have eternal life, and it cannot be destroyed, because God is only creator. And if it tends to go away from the created state and get destroyed, God prevents that and brings it back to life. This is what happens in Egypt. In Egypt, we don't see anyone crying. But the state of affair human was in Egypt itself was a cry that was brought before God. Every time human, from the history we see in the Bible, went away from God, God intervened and saved them. And therefore we may have to understand that the suffering human experienced was not from God, rather from human's own ways in this world, which was away from the way of God. I stop here and invite you for your comment. Yes.
Robin will whoever wants to speak out, ask a question, will raise their hands, and then Robin will call out the names.
Okay. Okay.
Robin, yeah.
Yes, I'm here.
Those who want to ask could raise their hands, please.
Joe Vakis has raised his hand first, so he can go ahead with the question. After that, San Marine one, I don't know your real name, but you're in queue.
Mary, I don't know whether this is too early in the session to ask, but the book of Revelation talks about the passing away of the current state of creation.
Okay.
Would that mean that is part of the redemptive process for all creation, or how do we look at that? If it's too early for this question, I can wait.
Well, if I would answer that, we had a program on Revelations, a book of Revelations, in a different platform a couple of weeks back. and I gave the first session, which was about, although my subject is Old Testament, I had done a special course in Book of Revelations when I was doing my doctoral program in Chicago, which is basically a sociological expression of the situation that existed during those days. The person who wrote it wanted to bring a new community by threatening people of God's wrath on people who would disobey Him. Till probably 13th century, our church did not recognize the Book of Revelations. The sectarian churches or the Pentecostal churches always wanted to use it because they would always prefer to creating an exclusive community among themselves and label others as outsiders. This is a very same message we see in the book of Revelation. And therefore, we may have to look into the book of Revelations with a different perspective. It's not the end of God's work, rather the end of their community, which is closed. At the end of the people who are outside their community, so that these people will be separated and to them saved. Book of Revelations is a very strange book, and we don't read from that book in our liturgical services except on Good Friday. Just one passage. We don't take that book very seriously. I don't know whether I addressed your question.
Thank you. That's definitely a different perspective which we need to meditate on, and I will do that.
Yeah.